Hello, and welcome back to the Sea People podcast. This podcast is about the stories of the sea and the people who steward it. I am thrilled to have two of my very first guests return to the pod, Meg and Terry. We will be exploring a wide variety of topics today, and I'm so excited to dive in. So, I would like to kick off today with a question and have Meg answer first. So, what is the most amazing ocean creature you have seen?
That's a tough question because there have been so many amazing. But I think I would have to put the whale shark at the top of the list because, number one, it's so big. And when I saw one, I'm an avid photographer, and I was snorkeling and I had my camera with me, and I was so amazed at the size of this creature, I forgot to take a picture. So I would have to say the whale shark.
Beautiful choice. And you, Terry?
Well, I'm going to go with an amazing creature that I first saw in the Philippines called the bobbit worm. And this is a segmented worm that is probably an inch and a half across, and it has these massive jaws that it holds out that are spring loaded, and it captures fish and eats them whole. And it moves with lightning quick speed, drags the fish into the sand, and it is, as I said, only about an inch and a half across, but it can be up to 9 feet long. And it is muscular, powerful, a voracious predator that moves with just incredible speed, and it's one of the scariest pound for pound creatures that I've ever seen.
Wow, I just learned something new today. I hope my listeners and viewers have too. Yeah, small but mighty is what I'm hearing, and then large and majestic. So, what a range! What a range of favorites. I love it so much. Um, I have to rack my brain for my favorite, but I would say it's a tie between two, like, I guess somewhat silly and whimsical, charismatic ones. I really love the puffer fish, just for its derpy face. And I also love dolphins, who are known to also play with the puffer fish. Or maybe that could just be one of those internet memes that have been floating around. But yes, two dynamic, and very different personality types. I have to shy away from anthropomorphizing these animals too. All right. Well, thank you so much. So fun to hear and learn about these ocean critters that you both have seen in the wild and their adaptive physiology. We will go into our main topics of today, kicking it off with some current events. So, as a marine community, there was a recent and major loss of a marine biologist in the Philippines. And I'll hand it over to you, Terry, to share with the audience that news.
Yeah, it's really shocking and sad news that one of the leading ichthyologists in the world, Dr. Kent Carpenter, was actually, brutally murdered in his home in the Philippines. Uh, in the last 2 weeks. And Kent was a dear friend and colleague. We spent a lot of time together, as has Meg. And Kent made some incredible contributions beyond the normal scientific contributions that one typically makes. And Kent was really remarkable in that he first started his love affair with the Philippines as a Peace Corps volunteer just out of college, and spent much of the rest of his life focused on studying the marine fauna of the Philippines, and was the first to really publish a paper saying that the Verde Island Passage of the Philippines, in terms of the shorefish species, which is the richest place in the marine environment anywhere on Earth, and this really set the stage for our launching a series of expeditions to really document that for a whole bunch of other groups of marine organisms. And it's also true for nudibranchs and corals and barnacle species and echinoderms, and every group that we looked at. This really is the center of marine biodiversity for those groups. So that's the thing that he is most well known for. But one of the most innovative things that Kent did was he was able to utilize museum collections made from the albatross expedition of the fish species that were collected in 1908, and be able to go back and look at their diversity in terms of genetic diversity in 1908 versus what you would find today. And the fish biota was much more diverse in 1908, and that's because overfishing has really narrowed the genetic diversity. And it's a brilliant example of mobilizing museum collections to study what the baseline was previously. And so, Kent was an amazing conservationist, brilliant biologist, great communicator, a dedicated person who worked for conservation of the Philippines and the entire Coral Triangle. And, we will certainly miss him a great deal.
Yes, yes. And Meg?
Well, I can't add too much to that other than it is such an unbelievable and tragic loss, such a pointless loss. And it's not just Terry and I, but the whole marine biology and conservation network is equally as shocked and in mourning.
Yes, yes. It is in times like these where you kind of hold your loved ones closer and celebrate the people in your life around you that you have. But I hope that the silver lining is that, which even if I can say if there's a silver lining, is that more people know about his work and his legacy will live on in terms of just how much, how much ahead of his time he was in terms of, like you were mentioning, Terry, taking these museum collections to track changes over time and compare the biodiversity from over 100 years ago to now and making those extrapolations. Can only hope that that research goes on, that his work is elevated, is promoted, is seen by more people outside of just the scientific community and beyond. Mm-hmm.
Right, and I hope that it provides more resolution to everybody to not just continue his work, but expand it and find new ways of trying to protect these marine ecosystems that were so important to him. And I'm not just to him, but to the Philippines in general.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And already, you know, so many people have tried to deal with their grief over his loss, in trying to figure out what is the most fitting memorial we can have in his memory. And we've already been having discussions that maybe this can be used as a vehicle for having greater protection for the Verde Island Passage. And there's a lot of discussion about how we can articulate this horrible event into something that has a lasting memory that really commemorates his commitment to protecting the marine environment.
Yeah, that would be such a special and enduring legacy to have if that is to materialize. I think that would be something to really celebrate in this time of grief. So I hope that effort sees success. And an image just came to mind as you were talking. When surfers leave or lose someone, they swim out into either a sunrise or sunset and a memorial, and think that even is just a beautiful like coming of community together, and in a very physical and dare I say sometimes spiritual setting. So that's just an image as well. And speaking of like the marine ecosystems that he's done so much conservation work on, especially in the Verde Island Passage in the Philippines, one particular ecosystem that both of you are very, very familiar with are coral reefs. So I would love to hear, and I ask this question as an Academy volunteer when I do the coral engagement. What is a coral? Is it an animal, a plant, or a mineral? Or is it all of the above? Who would like to tackle that first?
Well, I'll start off. So that is a great question, because a lot of people, especially in the Philippines and other island nations, where swimming is not really common among many of the people. If you don't swim and snorkel, what you know about corals, even if you live surrounded by coral reefs, are the dead pieces of coral that wash up on the beach. And they look like a rock with interesting holes in them. And so the answer to your question is they're not rocks. They are actually animals that secrete their own hard rock-like substance around the living animal. And I think that once people begin to understand that corals are living animals, then it begins to make more sense why it's damaging to throw an anchor out, for example. Because if you think it's rocks, it's like, what's the problem with the anchor hitting the rocks? But you're destroying the home of the animal. And I'm going to leave it to Terry to go into more detail, but the corals are pretty complex. They actually have the little polyps. Corals are like a jellyfish with tentacles, but that live inside this little stone-like house. And the corals themselves, however, have organisms living in them. They have organisms called zooxanthellae, which is probably one of the best words ever for Scrabble. Use a Z and an X. But those zooxanthellae are actually photosynthesizing as well. And rather than me telling all those intriguing details, I'm going to turn it over to Terry to carry on.
Yeah, and corals are really remarkable creatures, and that so many aspects of their biology, and Meg has really hit on one of the most important things, is that they do have this complex symbiotic relationship with algal chloroplasts that are in their tissues and provide maybe as much as 50% of the nutrition that corals need to survive. So when corals bleach, the first thing they do when they are not feeling well is they shed their zooxanthellae, and this immediately diminishes temporarily their ability to gain nutrition. And so that is the first sign of stress that one sees when they become too warm. So in that sense, it is fundamental to the reef building corals that we rely on to construct these remarkable coral reefs. But beyond just the biology of corals, corals provide structure and habitat to the whole living reef system. And, typically on a coral reef in the Coral Triangle, which is the area from the Philippines to Papua New Guinea and Indonesia that contains the richest diversity of corals, there can be between 500 and 600 species of corals making up that coral reef community. And this provides the home, the food, the foundation structurally for this entire diverse ecosystem that contains upwards of 25% of the marine organisms that inhabit the oceans. And yet they're only 0.25% of the ocean surface area is made up of coral reefs. So 0.25% to provide a home for 25% of the ocean's biodiversity. That's a remarkable concentration of diversity.
Yeah, that is a wild ratio if we think about it. And guests to Cal Academy are always wondering, with the number of species of coral, how fast they grow. They always ask all these really fascinating questions. One of them being, how do they even come up with these patterns? These very intricate patterns that are so species specific. I mean, there's the brain coral, there's the mushroom, antler or staghorn, just a handful of those that I have examples of, and I don't know if you have a ready answer for that, but I'm curious if you do, just so that for personal curiosity.
I don't think anybody has a definitive answer to what are the drivers of the different types of coral morphologies that you find, and
Terry's just doing the dance of the light dance.
The dance,
for the folks.
yes. It's nice to live in a sustainable building but it's challenging when you're trying to have a conversation. But corals, have all these different forms. But if you think of corals as sort of the ecological equivalents of the various trees that make up a forest and their diversity and their different types of adaptations, I think that's a fitting analogy to understanding why are there so many different types of corals and their forms. And one of the things that if you think of a forest and there being a forest fire, and after that forest begins to regrow and repopulate, some of the trees are very rapidly growing and are the pioneer species that begin to rebuild those communities and are only there temporarily, whereas other species come in more slowly, they're more slowly growing, and they are longer living. And so Each of them has their own ability to compete for light, for living with other organisms. Some are eaten more readily by herbivores. And the same is true of the corals, that they have this complexity of lifestyles where some are early pioneer species, some are slower growing, and generally the mounding corals versus the branching corals are the mounding corals are slower growing and persist longer, whereas the branching corals are often rapidly growing species. And one of the things that Meg and I were able to witness when we were in Palau in February and March is we saw a reef that had basically been completely destroyed by a typhoon about 12 years ago. And there were massive corals that were making up the reef there that had completely regrown since that first catastrophe 12 years ago. And you would not recognize it as a relatively new community. It looked like it had been there forever, with table corals that were probably 12 feet across. And when you think of that ability to rapidly grow and adapt, it's truly remarkable how coral reefs and corals in general can grow, and basically repopulated a devastated area so quickly.
Yeah, and I would add the question of how do they grow those incredible diverse forms. The simplest answer is basically it's a combination of genetics and environment. And so when you look at a brain coral, for example, that's sitting out there kind of by itself, that entire coral started from one coral polyp, that whole coral head. And so they're genetically all identical. So whatever genetic information that founding polyp has, that's how that coral head is going to grow. But the environment can make a big difference because you can have the same species of coral, a single species, and if it's in an environment where there's a really strong current, it's quite likely to have a different growth form than if it's in an area that's very still and calm. So, as usual, it's a complex answer to how they get their shape. And I did want to go back 1 minute to the zooxanthellae, these microscopic algae that are living inside the coral tissue. They are the ones that are giving the coral the color. So when you go snorkeling or scuba diving and you see a brown coral over here and a purple coral over there, it has to do with those symbionts, those microscopic algae that are living inside. And as Terry said, when the coral gets stressed, it expels those zooxanthellae, and that's why the coral looks bleached. It has lost its color.
Great.
Yeah, another really amazing thing about corals and their reproduction is that corals usually reproduce once a year, usually associated with a full moon. And they synchronously shed their eggs and sperm into the water column, and there's this sort of massive collective spawning that really
For one species.
Sorry?
For one species. Not all corals spawn at the same time.
Well, frequently a lot of them do, and they trigger each other's spawning. Once there are eggs and sperm in the water, a lot of them, you can see many different species shedding their eggs and sperm into the water.
I've heard that's called broadcast spawning.
Broadcast.
Yes.
And it's a great way. There are many, many other critters in the ocean that would love to eat those developing little corals, the sperm and the eggs. And so if you release millions and millions and millions, some are likely to make it and not get
Sounds like a snack. It sounds like a delicious snack for some barracuda, which is, I don't know, I'm taking this from Finding Nemo, however scientifically or unscientifically accurate that is. Okay. Well, yes, corals are such complex creatures, and I love the fact that you called out that the zooxanthellae is what gives it its color, because that particular note is what surprises most guests that I speak to. You can see just like the curiosity in their eyes, and you're like, oh, coral's color comes from this algae and not the animal. And it's also an animal. So all of these revelations going on, these conversations, I love it so much. And then in terms of the other animals, Terry, you had begun talking about that. What are some characteristic, I guess, animals that you see that make up a healthy coral reef ecosystem?
Well, certainly the variety of coral reef fishes, and again, in homage to Kent, the diversity of fish species that are reliant on corals. Some of them are direct predators on corals. Certainly, the most impactful group of fishes that feed on coral reefs are the parrotfish, and they use their hard parrot-like beak to actually take bites off of living corals, and anytime you are in a tropical white sandy beach, you're looking at the results of millions of parrotfish basically chewing on coral reefs and spitting out and pooping out fine coral sand that is the leftover remains of that meal. And sometimes that's one of the reasons we don't have parrotfish in the Academy's Coral Reef exhibit, is that corals are a lot of them are slow growing, and the last thing we can afford is to have all our carefully nurtured corals be turned into coral reef sand by a bunch of parrotfish. And so that's one of the things that's intentionally omitted from a lot of aquarium exhibits where you have live corals.
I did not know that. I mean, I knew that the parrotfish were voracious eaters and snacks of coral because they like the zooxanthellae, but I did not know that was why they were not in the tank. But that makes so much sense. Makes so much sense. And you can hear them crunching too out in the wild. That like snap, crackle, and pop sound, which is delightful, but also slightly unsettling sometimes as a first-time diver, I'm sure.
Well, when you hear that snap, crackle, pop, that's a good sign, because it means there aren't any even bigger predatory fish around, or sharks.
Or humans that have eaten all the large parrotfish.
That's true.
Ooh, I have never tried parrotfish, but interesting. Must be a delicacy.
I hate to admit that I have, but they're really delicious.
Oh, well, maybe one day, or maybe I'll just let them munch on the coral. All right. Another question I had around corals and the Academy is that I understand there's a coral spawning lab. And if either of you want to share more about the efforts there, why we even have it, and where those corals are going.
I'll let Terry take that one, since it's been a couple of years since I've actually seen the lab, and I'm sure it's advanced tremendously.
Yeah, and um, the the coral spawning lab is um, really one of the things that the Academy has pioneered, and it's under the leadership of our colleague Rebecca Albright, who is a coral reef biologist here at the Academy, and is a partnership between the Steinhardt Aquarium and the research area called the Institute of Biodiversity Science and Sustainability. And one of the things from our expeditions that we've undertaken is that in the Philippines, the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources, which is the agency responsible for studying coral reefs and for regulating fisheries in the Philippines, basically wanted some assistance and as to how to develop techniques to rear corals in the wild. The Coral Spawning Lab, which, as I mentioned earlier, but I'll reiterate that it's has been really established by a joint collaboration between the research side, the Institute for Biodiversity Science and Sustainability at the Academy, and our Steinhardt Aquarium. And both the aquatic biologists and Rebecca Albright and her lab have really established coral spawning and have reared corals now for 4 or 5 years and several generations of corals. And some of the great grandchildren of the original corals that spawn are still producing new annual spawns. And the great advantage of having a coral spawning lab is you get coral reproduction at a sexual level, which reinforces the genetic diversity of the corals, whereas typical fragmentation of corals only is asexual, and you don't get any maintenance of that overall genetic diversity. And so that's the huge advantage of having coral spawning, that increases that sexual reproduction and the diversity that it brings.
That is so, so cool. Because, yeah, it's that genetic diversity that breeds stronger, hardier corals, hopefully, that will withstand all that the climate people have been throwing at them. We've really done a good job of stressing them out. And to go back to a little bit more into what types of animals out there other than, let's say, marine fish that benefit and live within coral reef ecosystems. Meg, I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, certainly the fish are what a lot of people think of, and they're some of the biggest, but there are so many invertebrates besides the corals themselves. The number of mollusks, the animals with shells, or some mollusks don't have shells, as Terry will tell you, but the number of bivalves, the mollusks that have 2 shells, and the gastropods that have just 1 shell that's usually coiled. Incredible diversity. And then, of course, the nudibranchs that have no shells. But in addition, there are, on every tropical reef that I've seen, there are octopuses. I think octopuses is the proper plural, not octopi. And, different species of the octopus. There are all sorts of worms. There are all sorts of other invertebrates, and way too many to list. And I actually don't even have a clue how many species are on a quote-unquote typical tropical reef. I'm going to ask Terry if he knows that question. How many species total on a reef?
Oh, it depends on the reef.
Well, let's
Like
say,
everything else, it depends.
yeah,
But
let's say a reef
if
in the
you
Verde
went,
Island Passage.
I would say minimum 10,000 species.
Oh, I would have said more than that, so I'm glad I turned it over to you. And I think also another important point is we don't know, because every time somebody goes out there to study a reef, they're likely to find new species. Certainly Terry does with his nudibranchs.
Yeah,
10,000 and
and
more.
the
Yeah.
other thing that, if you think of a coral reef as really the the setting for so many different groups of organisms. There are so many, for example, crab species that are dependent on corals as not only a place to live, but to have specific adaptations. There are coral gall crabs that create an irritation so that the coral grows around them and they live inside these galls that they've facilitated growth. Um, Meg mentioned clams and pittocks that burrow into corals and are living inside living corals. There's so many different organisms. Think of Christmas tree worms that you see on coral reefs, which are burrowed into living corals. There are just literally dozens and dozens of species. There are species of nudibranchs that are specialist predators on living corals, and they don't do much damage to coral reef, but they help control the balance so that no species dominates. And with regard to the coral feeding nudibranchs, we once thought that there were 7 species. We've now identified more than 70 species of nudibranchs that are predators on corals.
Oh, and we can't forget the sponges. There's an incredible diversity of sponges on coral reefs as well, and tunicates.
I have fortunately and or unfortunately eaten a tunicate. It was a very interesting texture. But yes. There's so many different types of critters, animals, fauna and flora that thrive and adapt. And I just, as you were describing, these animals that are like burrowing and settling and finding little chasms and galls to live in. I'm just thinking, oh wow, they're just all architecting in harmony their homes and finding the crevices and again, yeah, feeding off of each other. So very interesting, harmonious symphony of relationships.
I have heard coral reef ecosystems referred to as cities, with all these different citizens, and everybody has a different job to do. But in the end, by all being there doing their own job, you create this incredible community.
And just like cities, let us not forget the suburbs, which in the case of coral reefs are mangrove communities and seagrass communities and all the associated communities that are reliant on coral reefs for their survival, and in turn, coral reefs are reliant on those other ancillary suburban communities that are found in and around coral reefs.
I think we need another episode called The Suburbs of the Sea. I see that. I see it in our future. I want to go back to this question of we don't know how many species are out there. just for, the lack of resources, people, funding we talked a little bit about, and just maybe like the type of equipment that it can handle the pressure of deep sea exploration as well. Another topic to touch on in another time, but more like a philosophical as existential question is like, what is enough? How do we know when we've gathered enough and discovered enough? Because I think in a prior conversation, a little bit outside of the recording time, we're talking about human perception, because humans can maybe only hold so much information in our minds, especially in this age of information and age of content. If you ask someone who is not in, arachnid expert or spider expert, they'd be like, I only want to know 2 species of spiders. But if you were to ask a scientist who is specializing in spiders, they would be curious to know and discover more than perhaps their field of study has allowed them so far. So yeah, starting with Meg, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what is enough, and enough for who?
That last part of your question, enough for who, is really important, because the answer does differ, I think, depending on who the audience is or who has been asked that question. As a scientist, I'd say there's never enough. There's always more information to learn, new species to be discovered. There's no way that scientists have documented all the species. Just the other day, a new species of monkey, new species of primate was discovered, and they're pretty big and noticeable. So, there's the fact that we're still discovering new species of all types is really significant, and you never know when that next new discovery might lead to something really important, whether it's a new drug that can fight some serious illness or something like that. And so from a scientific point of view, I believe the more we can find out, the better. Now, from the point of view of a manager of a wildlife reserve, maybe they don't need to know every single species that's there, or a governor or a mayor.
Well, and let's put that in the perspective of what is our level of knowledge of coral reefs right now. And the best guesstimate that we have is that we know less than 10% of the species that inhabit coral reefs. And if you try and sort of project that level of knowledge and extrapolate that out to other disciplines, think if you were trying to do chemistry where you knew 10% of the elements on the periodic table. You'd be back in the 1600s, and that is really what our level of knowledge is equivalent in the terms in the world of biodiversity. And so we're trying to make the best stabs at developing policy and management decisions based on very, very incomplete knowledge. And we know more about some of the dominant species and what we call keystone species that are really important in shaping that whole diversity. But so many of the other organisms that we don't know about, we don't know what their impact is. And, for example, we've only recently discovered a virus that kills starfish on the California coast. And why is that important? Because starfish are keystone species. And in 2013, we lost the bulk of the predatory starfish on the California coast. The impact of that was that sea urchins proliferated because they were the prey of a lot of these large species of sea stars. And as a result, they overpopulated the area. They ate kelp, and virtually most of the kelp beds on the northern coast of California disappeared and are only now starting to come back. And so the potential impact of something like a small microbe that was previously unknown has been profound in terms of its shaping major changes in that ecosystem that relies on having starfish predators as keystone predators.
Yes, there's so much at play when we don't know what we don't know. That's one of the beautiful mysteries of being alive in this natural world, but that's also a great opportunity to discover. And with political will, resources, awareness, I'd also like to bring it back to, I mean, we had already kind of gone over a little bit of it, but the things that can benefit the coastal communities and people and humanity and beyond, whether it is sustainable kind of food sources, right? With the tropical fish, I mean, Terry, you got to taste some parrotfish. Other fishes are sustenance really for these island and seaside communities. There are also, kelps that are integral for, materials that maybe we buy and use and eat every day. And there are also pharmaceuticals that have yet to be discovered and have already been discovered from corals. So if either of you want to add more to these like ecosystem benefits that corals provide to people, I welcome that.
Well, I would add, in addition to the fish, there's certainly the aquarium fish trade is huge in many places. And again, efforts are being made to make that a more sustainable one. It goes back to being able to raise corals in captivity, raising fish in captivity too. All of that takes pressure off the animals living in the wild. But in addition to the aquarium trade, there's also the physical benefits presented by a coral reef, especially when it comes to tropical storms, typhoons, whatever they're locally called, hurricanes. Land areas that are protected by coral reefs suffer much less storm damage. And I would also add mangrove trees do the same. So we will have to go to the suburbs at some point and talk about mangroves as well as the coral reefs.
Yeah, and we know from very practical examples that thousands of lives are saved every year by healthy coral reefs and mangrove communities. And we've seen the loss of life, the loss of property, the financial impact, as well as the human toll that these super typhoons that have accelerated in frequency and in terms of intensity with climate change, that many thousands of human lives are spared every year by having healthy ecosystems to absorb that wave shock of typhoons.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, I think there is like a local California effort to either install, is it real living reefs or artificial reefs to serve as a buffer against the waves that are crashing to the pier. I can't remember if it was Pacifica or somewhere. I think it's like a community like effort or petition to do that. But yeah, these natural structures are really protecting humanity in so many ways that a lot of people might not necessarily know. And again, awareness and better marketing, perhaps, for these animals and structures that don't have voices of their own. That's why there are podcasts and films and movies and music and books and things like that, and of course scientific research that hopefully surfaces it all to the public. I would like to end on a kind of community call out, just to get a sense of bringing it back to the people who are so instrumental into these efforts happening. And if one of you wants to start, I'd love to hear more about how, especially in the Philippines, the types of partnerships, NGOs and or for-profit, and whatever type of organization you've partnered with in the local people, how they have really shaped the conservation efforts that you have both collectively done over the years.
Terry, go ahead if you want to start, and I'll
Well, so many grassroots environmental heroes have really developed new ways of protecting coral reefs and all over the world. And it often starts with a community leader who has the insight that things could be better and is willing to take those positive steps to make small changes, to set aside certain areas as either marine protected areas or reduce the kinds of harmful fishing, such as blast fishing, that have really fundamentally changed that landscape. And, I often talk about when I first went to the Philippines, you could hear the dynamite explosions of blast fishing all around you when you were underwater, and that doesn't occur. It only occurs very rarely in remote places where there isn't effective enforcement of the laws that protect those environments. People setting aside marine protected areas have reaped the benefits of fish coming back, of reefs becoming restored. They've been witness to the power of making those positive changes. And those community leaders provide the grassroots foundation for making sure that those policies will continue in the future. And it is so much more effective to have this ground up, bottom up community approach rather than a top down regulatory approach from a national government that is trying to impose regulations on people rather than the people themselves driving that. And to me, that's the power of this kind of grassroots effort, is that it forces the government officials to actually take more powerful and widespread protective measures than because the community is the driver of that policy.
First of all, I totally agree with Terry that certainly in the Philippines, the most successful and impactful conservation efforts have been at the grassroots level. The people who live in the communities where the reefs are literally right out their back door. At the same time, in our work there, we have collaborated at all levels, from national government agencies down to the provinces and their agencies and the individual municipalities and their agencies, and working also not just with the government levels, but also with the NGOs, the other nonprofits that are there with similar missions, and also the academics, the academia, because they are incredible partners. One of the challenges that Terry and I and other Academy scientists have had is we're not over there most of the time, so we have to rely on local partners as well.
Yeah, and just sort of getting back to that analogy of a coral reef being a city, conservation is a city in itself as well, and that it's a network of, if you think of New York City being a series of smaller communities within this metropolis, and that each one of those small communities has its own leadership, and that builds to looking at this on a much larger scale. And so it's those networks and the connections between those networks that really ultimately leads to the success and the cohesiveness of that larger entity of conservation work that's being done.
These analogies really work for me. I'll be in New York next week, actually, and I'll just be thinking about the little boroughs as, little municipalities with the crustaceans being, burrowing into the corals.
And you're talking about Greenwich Village. It's a village within this huge metropolitan center, and it requires all of those entities working together. Mm-hmm. So it works ecologically, it works in the conservation world. Those kinds of models really are more than just frivolous analogies. They have some reality to them.
Yeah, I like how we can borrow from nature and then borrow back from civilization to map out our collective understandings of how these complex ecosystems and relationships work. Okay. Well, I hate for this to end. Every time I feel like we can talk for hours on more of these threads to pull, but the time has come, and I know Terry has something to plug, so I'll hand it back to you, Terry, to plug away.
Great. Well, thanks. I will try and make this quick, but recently I was approached by a sportswear manufacturer called Waterlust that has just come out with a new line of swimming and beach apparel that features nudibranch designs. And it's a really interesting company because their model is for every line of apparel that they produce, they connect with a scientific lab, and 5% of the proceeds of all their sales go to support that scientific effort. And they've selected our nudibranch lab at the Academy as the beneficiary of the sales of this new nudibranch line. And I'm really excited to be working with them. They're great partners. They want scientific content on their website and to all the purchasers of their products. And they fact-checked everything with experts to make sure that it's scientifically accurate. And it's really a great model, and one that I'm really excited and proud to be working with, because they are doing some really meaningful things, and not only bringing great designs, but bringing knowledge and support for the scientific work that's the foundation for that.
That is incredible. So what you're telling us, Terry, is next time we see you, you will be sporting some beautiful nudibranch adorned rash guard from Wanderlust and or swim trunks. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. Waterlust is
Or what Wanderlust?
doing they've got whale shark designs. They've got, you should definitely check out their website. They're
Okay.
doing really cool things.
We will include it in the show notes. Absolutely. And yes, I can't wait to see that. I love seeing and hearing about these innovative models, right? I know I can't remember which, maybe Tom's was one of the earlier
Yeah.
shoe brands that started, buy a pair, give a pair, buy swim trunks, supported the Brink Lab. These like kind of direct impact avenues are kind of what keeps people interested, aware, and have, again, a deeper understanding. And I love that it's geared towards this marine scientific community who are curious about these critters and fashion. can't forget about fashion. Form and function. And facts. Okay. All right. My marketing brain is going. But thank you both again, Meg and Terry, for another delightful conversation about corals, critters, community, and impact. We will surely be talking about the suburbs of the sea and more in future episodes. So again, appreciate your time and sharing space, and together let's see people as sea people.
All right. And thank you, Michelle.
Yes. Thanks a lot.
Sea People is a production by Seafoam Studio. I'm Michelle, your host. This is a space to be expansive and explore the underwater world of stories of the sea and the people who steward it. Sea People is available on wherever you find your podcasts. If you would like to leave a rating and review, please do. There will be a form in the show notes to give feedback, because feedback is a gift. Episodes will be released bi-weekly, so stay tuned for the next one. Thank you for listening.